one of the interesting course that you have enrolled, Network Vulnerability Assessment using Nessus. What we are going to discuss, this is the first lecture of the first section. Let me, the topic, this is the name of this particular section, the foundation of vulnerability assessment. And the objective of this particular section is to create the foundation, the ground for the vulnerability assessment process, and what topics that for the vulnerability assessment process, and what topics that we are going to discuss throughout this course. This particular section has been further divided into 3 important lectures. First one is what is vulnerability assessment, what do you mean by vulnerability assessment, what we have, and then the types of vulnerability assessment, the vulnerability assessment process. So let's start our first lecture. What is vulnerability assessment? So according to Wikipedia, vulnerability assessment is the process of identifying, quantifying, and prioritizing or ranking the vulnerability in a system. So it seems a very systematic approach, and yes, reviewing the complex codes annually is not feasible anymore. We need a systematic approach to find the errors or bugs in any piece of code. So first of all, let's define this particular word, vulnerability. Vulnerability is a common English word, and when we talk about vulnerability in terms of computing or IT, it means the weakness in a computer system or any programming error, misconfiguration. This include anything from a weak password on a router to an unpatched programming flaw in an exposed network service that could allow an attacker to get the unauthorized access. This is very important. A vulnerability could allow an attacker to get an unauthorized access. So fixing the vulnerability is very crucial in any corporate or even home environment. Let's move further to classify the vulnerability for hackers and spammers. They both treat as, how they exploit the vulnerability. Hackers used to exploit the vulnerability to gain the unauthorized access, as discussed, while the spammers use to exploit the vulnerability to achieve their malicious purposes. For example, botnets created by exploiting the vulnerability on a mouse level. Compromised zombie proxy of today, which is also called botnets, created through the mass exploitation of common vulnerabilities, where a large number of systems exploit by the spammers to achieve to launch their attack. So in a nutshell, if we define the vulnerability assessment, then vulnerability assessment is the process of identifying and reporting vulnerabilities in a computer system, software, process, application, and infrastructure. So anything related to computing. Alright, let's move further. So vulnerability assessment is a phase-wise approach to identifying the vulnerabilities existing in an infrastructure. This can be done using automated scanning tools such as Nessus, which use its set of plugins corresponding to different types of known security loopholes in infrastructure. And there are another approach. There are 2 approaches. First one is automatic vulnerability assessment based on the tools like Nessus, OpenVAS, and we have a different set of tools. And while the other approach is the manual approach. Manual checklist based approach basically uses best practices and published on well-known vulnerability tracking sites. The manual approach is not as comprehensive as a tool-based approach and will be more time consuming. The kind of checks that are performed by a vulnerability assessment tool can also be done manually, but this will take a lot of more time than as compared to automatic vulnerability assessment process. But both approaches has their own merits and demerits. Sometimes a vulnerability a tool basically is not able to detect a vulnerability, but a manual reviewing the code can find a vulnerability. Think about this 0-day or the other type of vulnerability or exploits. So vulnerability and vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. Even so, I have seen so many professionals working in the field, and they don't even have the idea difference between the vulnerability assessment and the penetration testing. These terms are these both terms relatively are the same or can be used interchangeably, but with a minor difference. Penetration testing has an additional step for vulnerability assessment, exploiting the vulnerabilities. Yes, when you conduct penetration testing, you find the vulnerability, you go through all the vulnerability assessment process, but you also exploit the vulnerability to justify your point, to give proof of concept that this particular found vulnerability is actually a real threat. You go for exploitation. Just not only find the vulnerability, report the vulnerability, and that's it. You further exploit it. So penetration testing is an intrusive set where the person doing the penetration test will first do a vulnerability assessment to identify the vulnerabilities, and as a next step will try to penetrate the system by exploiting the identified vulnerabilities. So this is how it actually goes. So we have discussed the difference between vulnerability assessment and penetration testing, the approaches, the basic definition, and on the next chapter we are going to discuss the types of vulnerability assessment, what types of vulnerability assessment do we have, and then the vulnerability assessment process. So